Hello, my name is Dr. Esa. Welcome to Missio International channel. Today I'm going to give a very brief overview of migration in the Bible. Rather than looking at every single detail about migration, I will focus on the grand narrative or story of the Bible and how migration fits into it. Let's see what we can find. Before looking at the story of migration in the Bible, I want to highlight the important events and covenants in the biblical story. After all, Bible is a continual story that moves forward from the beginning, creation, all the way to the end, to the new creation. As Genesis tells us, the creation of the world is followed by Adam's and Eve's fall into sin. This is followed by the primeval stories and in particular the stories of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And during these times, God makes a particular covenant with Abraham. This is followed by the story of Moses and giving of law at Mount Sinai, obviously highlighting the covenant with Moses. Joshua and Judges tell us about the conquest of the land and the subsequent monarchy under Saul, David, and Solomon. During this time, God makes a covenant with David. After David's son Solomon, the kingdom is divided into the northern and southern kingdom, and finally both kingdoms are taken to exile. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, on the other hand, tells us about the return of the exiles, and the prophets prophesy about the promise of the new covenant in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. After the so-called silent years, we see the coming and birth of Jesus Christ, his teachings, his life, death, and resurrection. And of course, the new covenant is inaugurated by Jesus. And after the resurrection, the Holy Spirit is poured out and the church moves forward, proclaiming the gospel and multiplying to the ends of the earth. I'm sure that you're familiar with this basic storyline and outline of the biblical narrative. Well, let's start from the beginning. God created human beings, Adam and Eve, in his own image, and they were given a command to fill the earth. From this, we can see that filling the earth implies moving around, moving about, and thus migration. Hence, we can say that migration was in God's mind already before the fall of humanity. And as such, we should not consider it as a curse or contrary to God's plans. However, as Adam and Eve fall into sin, we can see that they are banished from the garden and thus become the first refugees or migrants in the world. And we can see in the subsequent stories of Cain and Abel, Cain is banished and becomes an aimless wanderer. And in many of the following stories, nations and individuals are scattered as a result of God's judgment or as a result of conflict or wars. Yet Abraham is commanded by God to leave his homeland in Mesopotamia and go to a land that God is giving to him, thus becoming the migrant that sets out by faith and with whom God makes a covenant. Abraham's family, Isaac and Jacob, and specifically Joseph, also migrate either due to circumstances such as Jacob fleeing Esau or Joseph being sold into slavery into Egypt. Moses himself is also a migrant as he flees Egypt and subsequently brings the Israelites out of Egypt into the wilderness and to the borders of the promised land. Exodus and the mass migration from Egypt and the wandering in the wilderness in itself is a sort of mass migration. Obviously, then with the leadership of Joshua, the people of Israel take over the land of Canaan, settle there, and find a more established home. Yet when David is anointed as a king, he does not reach the kingship before being persecuted severely by Saul, and therefore he has to flee to the surrounding nations, including Philistine and Gad and other areas. His is a life of wanderer before God finally gives him the kingdom. During the divided kingdom, various tribes are displaced, and we can see wanderers and refugees and migration throughout the books of the first and second kings as well. But this all culminates into the two exiles, namely the Assyrian and Babylonian exile, where God's people are displaced and they have to flee their homeland either as refugees or they are forcefully taken into the captivity. God's people are displaced and they mourn the loss of their identity, they mourn the loss of their homeland, as we can see, for example, in Psalm 137, where the psalmist laments and says, "By the rivers of Babylon we wept, remembering Zion." Of course, then subsequently, God releases his people and they return back to the promised land. However, this brings about new difficulties as the people need to resettle and rediscover their lost identity. During the so-called intertestamental times, God's people experience oppression and diaspora or scattering throughout the known world as well. However, when we come to the birth of Jesus, we find the baby Jesus himself becomes a refugee, as King Herod in his murderous jealousy wants to wipe out the children of Bethlehem, and thus Joseph and Mary take Jesus to Egypt as a refugee. In his adult life, Jesus also from the Nazareth and of Galilee embarks on an itinerant ministry where he is characterized as homeless with nowhere to lay his head. After the day of Pentecost, after the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the disciples are commanded to go into all the world and make disciples of all the nations in the power of the Holy Spirit. Even though the 12 disciples are reluctant to depart from Jerusalem, the subsequent persecution scatters the church in Jerusalem, as we can find in Acts chapter 7, 8, 9, and 11. The story of the early church from Acts of Apostles to the end of Revelation is that of migration. Author of Hebrews characterizes God's people as strangers and exiles on the earth, as ones who are seeking a homeland. This is obviously talks about the spiritual migration of God's people, but the spiritual migration is often juxtaposed or connected with the physical migration that God's people often have to embark due to persecution, difficulties, or sometimes even for studying, such as Apostle Paul did as he and his family moved from Tarsus to Jerusalem, or for other reasons, even such mundane reasons as business, as we can see in the life of Priscilla and Aquila and others in the Acts of Apostles. These stories indicate that God uses movements of people and individuals to advance his kingdom and to bring about his purposes. And from all this, we can see that God never makes mistakes. He is in charge of his people, and that he never makes mistakes, but directs individuals and nations and communities according to his own will. And this is the story of migration in the Bible in a nutshell. If there's an area that you would like to know more about, please let me know by making a suggestion for further videos or teachings, or through contacting me through the comment section below.